David crashed our family barbecue after 5 years of no contact and made an announcement that turned my new marriage upside down and shocked everyone present. The smell of charcoal and burger grease filled our backyard as I balanced 3 plates of potato salad, trying not to drop them while navigating around my niece who was chasing our dog with a water gun. It was one of those perfect summer afternoons where everything felt right with the world. My husband was manning the grill wearing that ridiculous apron my sister got him that says Grill Sergeant, and I could hear my mom laughing at something my brother said from across the yard. We'd been planning this barbecue for weeks. It was supposed to be a celebration of sorts. Our 3rd wedding anniversary was coming up and we just finished renovating the kitchen after months of living off takeout and using paper plates. Having everyone over felt like christening our newly normal life. My in-laws had driven down from 3 states away, my college roommate flew in with her kids, and even my notoriously antisocial neighbor had accepted our invitation. I was setting the plates down on our new patio table when I heard the gate creak open. Without looking up, I called out for whoever it was to grab a drink from the cooler, assuming it was another neighbor or maybe someone's +1 running late. The conversations around me continued. Someone was debating whether hot dogs counted as sandwiches, and my father-in-law was telling that story about the time he accidentally caught a seagull while fishing. But then the yard went quiet in that way that makes your stomach drop before you even know why. I looked up to see everyone staring toward the gate, their expressions ranging from confused to concerned. My husband had stopped flipping burgers mid-flip, the spatula frozen in his hand like he'd been put on pause. That's when I turned around and saw him. David. Standing there in our backyard like he belonged there, like the last 5 years hadn't happened, like he hadn't completely vanished from my life after our divorce was finalized. He looked older, his hair a little thinner, but he had that same confident stance that used to make me feel safe and later made me feel trapped. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it over the music still playing from the Bluetooth speaker. Nobody moved. My mom's face had gone completely white and I could see my brother's hands clench into fists. David's eyes found mine across the yard, and for a second I felt like I was 25 again, standing in our old apartment, fighting about money and his drinking and all the ways we'd grown to hurt each other. He walked further into the yard with that purposeful stride I remembered, and I found myself taking a step backward, bumping into the table and nearly knocking over the potato salad I just set down. My husband finally moved, stepping away from the grill and positioning himself slightly in front of me, though his expression was more bewildered than protective. David cleared his throat, and in that moment I realized how absolutely insane this situation was. Here was my ex-husband, who I hadn't seen or heard from since the day he moved his stuff out of our house, standing in my current backyard in front of my current husband and my entire family, about to say something that I knew with every fiber of my being was going to change everything. He looked around at all the faces staring at him, took a deep breath, and then spoke with the kind of certainty that made my blood run cold. He announced that our divorce was never legally finalized due to a clerical error at the courthouse, meaning my current marriage was completely invalid. The words hit me like a physical blow, and I actually grabbed onto the table to steady myself. The silence that followed was deafening. Someone's drink hit the ground, the plastic cup bouncing twice before rolling under a chair. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, waiting for me to respond, to explain, to do something other than stand there with my mouth hanging open like a fish. But I couldn't process what he was saying. A clerical error? How was that even possible? We'd sat in that courthouse 5 years ago, signed all the papers, shook hands with the clerk. I remembered every detail of that day because it was supposed to be the end of the worst chapter of my life. I kept copies of everything, filed them away in the folder I never wanted to look at again. David continued talking, his voice getting stronger as he went on. He said he'd discovered the error recently when he was trying to get some insurance paperwork sorted out. He'd hired someone to look into it, and they'd confirmed that due to some filing mistake, our marriage had never been legally dissolved. He was still my husband. My current marriage was meaningless in the eyes of the law. I felt like I was having an out-of-body experience. This couldn't be happening. This was the kind of thing that happened in soap operas, not real life. Not my life. I'd worked so hard to build something new, something healthy and stable, and now David was standing there telling me it was all built on a foundation of lies. My current husband's face had gone through about 6 different emotions in the span of 30 seconds. Confusion, anger, disbelief, and something that looked like hurt. He kept looking between me and David like he was trying to solve a puzzle that didn't have all its pieces. David wasn't finished. He took another step closer and said he wanted me back. He said he'd spent the last 5 years thinking about our marriage, about what went wrong, about how he could fix it. He'd gotten sober, he said. He'd been going to meetings, working on himself, and he realized that losing me was the worst mistake he'd ever made. Now that he knew we were still legally married, he saw it as a sign that we were meant to be together. The nerve of him. The absolute nerve. He disappeared without a word, left me to pick up the pieces of the life we'd built together, let me believe I was free to move on, and now he was standing in my backyard talking about signs and second chances like he had any right to either. I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to tell him exactly what I thought about his timing and his revelations and his complete lack of consideration for anyone but himself. But I couldn't find my voice. All I could think about were the legal implications. If what he was saying was true, then what did that mean for my house? My bank accounts? My insurance? The life I'd built with my current husband? My mind started racing through all the paperwork I'd signed over the past 3 years. Our mortgage application, our joint tax returns, the emergency contact forms at work where I'd listed my current husband as my spouse. Had I been committing fraud this whole time without knowing it? Could I go to jail for this? The practical concerns started overwhelming the emotional ones, and I felt like I was drowning in questions I didn't have answers to. The worst part was seeing how this was affecting everyone else. My mom looked like she might faint. My sister was holding her daughter protectively like David's presence might somehow contaminate the whole gathering. My in-laws, who had always been nothing but kind to me, looked completely lost. They'd welcomed me into their family with such warmth, and now they were finding out their son's marriage might not even be real. I finally found my voice, though it came out smaller and shakier than I wanted. I asked David how he could possibly think this was the right time or place to drop this bomb on me. How he could show up at a family gathering and blow up my entire life in front of everyone I cared about. Didn't he think I deserved to hear this privately? Didn't he care about anyone else's feelings but his own? He had the audacity to look hurt by my reaction. He said he'd tried calling, but my number had changed. He tried reaching out through mutual friends, but we didn't have any left after the divorce. He said he'd been watching the house for weeks, trying to work up the courage to approach me, and when he saw the gathering today, he thought it would be better to be honest with everyone at once rather than put me in the position of having to explain it later. The manipulation in his words made me sick. He was framing his ambush as some kind of favor to me, like he was being considerate by humiliating me publicly instead of privately. It was so typical of him to twist the situation to make himself look like the thoughtful one, the victim, the one who was just trying to do the right thing. But then something unexpected happened. My current husband started laughing. Not a nervous laugh or a bitter laugh, but actual, genuine laughter that got stronger and louder until he was doubled over, clutching his sides like he'd just heard the funniest joke in the world. Update 1. Everyone stared at my husband like he'd completely lost his mind. Here we were, dealing with what felt like the end of the world, and he was having some kind of breakdown right in front of everyone. I started to worry that the stress had actually broken something in his brain, that he was having some kind of psychological break from the shock of finding out his marriage wasn't real. But he kept laughing, and then he started walking toward David with this huge grin on his face. I watched in complete bewilderment as he clapped David on the shoulder like they were old friends meeting up for drinks. The casual familiarity of the gesture made my stomach lurch. Something was very, very wrong with this picture. That's when the first domino fell. My husband looked around at all our shocked faces and announced that he and David had actually been in touch for months. They'd been meeting up, talking, working through the complicated history between them. He said it started when David reached out through social media, wanting to make amends for how things had ended between us. I felt like the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. My husband had been secretly talking to my ex-husband? For months? The betrayal hit me harder than David's announcement about the divorce papers. This was the man I'd trusted with my heart, my home, my future, and he'd been lying to me every single day for months. The backyard felt like it was spinning. I grabbed onto the nearest chair, trying to anchor myself to something solid while my entire reality shifted around me. Everyone was still staring, still waiting for an explanation that made sense, but nothing about this situation made sense anymore. My husband continued talking, his voice getting more excited as he went on. He said he and David had discovered they actually had a lot in common. They both loved baseball, they both had complicated relationships with their fathers, they both cared about me deeply. What had started as a tense conversation about the past had evolved into something resembling friendship. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How do you become friends with someone who hurt the person you love? How do you bond with the man whose emotional manipulation and drinking had left me so broken that I'd spent years in recovery, learning how to trust again? How do you look me in the eye every morning and kiss me goodbye, knowing you're keeping this massive secret? David was nodding along, looking pleased with himself in that way that made me want to throw something at his head. He started talking about how my current husband was actually a really great guy, how he could see why I'd fallen for him, how they both realized they wanted what was best for me. The condescension in his tone made my skin crawl. Here were two men discussing my life and my feelings like I wasn't standing right there, like they had the right to make decisions about what was best for me. My brother finally spoke up, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. He wanted to know what kind of sick game they were playing, showing up to a family gathering to pull this kind of stunt. He pointed out that there were kids present, that this wasn't the time or place for whatever twisted reunion they had planned. But my husband held up his hand, still grinning like he was having the time of his life. He said there was more to the story, that we needed to let him finish before everyone got upset. The casual way he dismissed everyone's legitimate anger made me want to scream. We were supposed to wait patiently while he explained why he'd been lying to me for months? David reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a manila envelope. My heart rate spiked again, thinking he was about to produce the documentation that would prove our divorce was invalid, that would legally bind me to him forever. But instead, he handed the envelope to my husband, who opened it with theatrical flourish. Inside were what looked like official documents, but when my husband held them up, I could see they were blank except for some kind of letterhead. He announced that the whole thing about the clerical error was completely made up. Our divorce was perfectly valid, had been from the beginning, and my current marriage was absolutely legal and binding. The relief should have been immediate and overwhelming, but instead I felt a new kind of rage building in my chest. They had put me through emotional torture for what? Some kind of elaborate joke? I looked around at my family members, at my in-laws, at the friends who had driven hours to be here, and saw the same confusion and anger reflected in their faces. My mom found her voice first, demanding to know what was wrong with them, putting everyone through this kind of stress. My sister was already packing up her daughter's toys, clearly ready to leave and take her child away from whatever dysfunction was playing out in our backyard. The party atmosphere was completely destroyed, and I couldn't see how anything they could say would make this okay. But my husband wasn't done. He said the fake announcement was all part of an elaborate setup for something else, something he'd been planning for weeks. David wasn't here to win me back or to reveal any legal problems with our marriage. He was here to help my husband pull off what he called the most over-the-top surprise in the history of romantic gestures. I stared at both of them, trying to process this new information. An elaborate setup for what? What could possibly justify putting me and everyone I cared about through this kind of emotional manipulation? What surprise could be worth making me believe my entire life was built on a lie? My husband reached into his own pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. My heart did something complicated, caught between hope and fury. He dropped to one knee right there in the grass, surrounded by abandoned plates of food and confused family members, and said he wanted to ask me something. But this wasn't a proposal. We were already married. The ring box wasn't for an engagement ring. He opened it to reveal a beautiful band that matched my wedding ring, and he said he wanted to ask me to marry him again. He wanted to renew our vows, to celebrate 3 years of marriage and many more to come, and he'd wanted it to be a surprise that no one would ever forget. The gesture was romantic in theory, but the execution was so misguided that I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He traumatized me and my entire family, enlisted my manipulative ex-husband as an accomplice, and ruined what was supposed to be a simple, happy gathering, all in service of a surprise I'd never asked for and didn't want. Update 2. The silence stretched on while I tried to figure out how to respond to this mess. My husband was still on one knee, holding up the ring box with an expectant smile, while David stood behind him looking proud of their collaboration. The rest of our guests looked like they were watching a car accident in slow motion, unable to look away but deeply uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. I could feel everyone waiting for me to react with joy and gratitude, to swoon over the romantic gesture and forgive the emotional manipulation because the intentions were supposedly good. But I couldn't summon any of those feelings. All I felt was exhausted and betrayed and angry at the complete lack of consideration for my feelings throughout this entire charade. My voice came out flat and tired when I finally spoke. I told my husband to get up, that we needed to talk privately, and that everyone else should probably go home because the party was clearly over. The deflation in his expression was immediate and obvious. This wasn't the reaction he'd been hoping for, the gratitude and excitement he'd expected in return for his elaborate surprise. David, reading the room better than my husband apparently could, started backing toward the gate. But I stopped him before he could leave. If he'd been part of orchestrating this disaster, he was going to be part of dealing with the aftermath. He didn't get to drop this bomb on my life and then slip away while I cleaned up the pieces. My mom came over and hugged me, whispering that she'd help clean up and that I should take all the time I needed to process what had just happened. My sister was already loading her daughter into the car, shooting dark looks at both men as she gathered their things. The party guests began the awkward process of collecting their belongings and making excuses about early mornings and long drives home. Within 20 minutes, our backyard was empty except for the three of us and the remnants of what was supposed to be a celebration. Paper plates scattered across the grass, the grill still smoking, drinks abandoned on tables. It looked like the aftermath of something much worse than a ruin party. I sat down heavily in one of the patio chairs and tried to organize my thoughts. Where did I even start with this conversation? The lying? The manipulation? The complete disregard for my emotional well-being? The involvement of my ex-husband in what was supposed to be a romantic gesture? The fact that my current husband thought any of this was a good idea? My husband sat down across from me, still holding the ring box, his earlier excitement replaced by growing concern. He started to explain that he'd only wanted to do something special, something that would show me how much our marriage meant to him. He'd been thinking about it for months, trying to come up with a way to celebrate our anniversary that would be memorable and meaningful. But I cut him off before he could get too far into his justification. I told him that if he'd wanted to do something special for our anniversary, he could have planned a nice dinner or a weekend getaway or even just written me a heartfelt letter. He didn't need to create an elaborate lie that made me question everything about our life together. He didn't need to bring my ex-husband into our marriage. He didn't need to traumatize our families and friends. David had been standing awkwardly by the fence, clearly wanting to leave but not sure if he was dismissed. I turned to him and asked him how he could possibly have thought this was a good idea. He'd been married to me for 6 years. He knew my history with anxiety, my need for stability and honesty in relationships. How could he think I'd appreciate being made to feel like my world was falling apart, even temporarily? He shifted uncomfortably and said he'd thought it would be different coming from my current husband, that I'd see it as romantic rather than manipulative. But his words rang hollow. David knew exactly what he was doing when he agreed to this plan. He knew it would upset me, and part of me suspected he'd enjoyed the idea of disrupting my stable, happy life, even if it was supposedly for a good cause. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. My current husband had spent months planning this elaborate deception, meeting secretly with my ex-husband, crafting the story about invalid divorce papers. He'd looked me in the eye every day for months, knowing he was going to put me through this experience, and he'd never once stopped to consider how I might actually feel about it. I asked him how many times he'd lied to me over the past few months. How many times had I asked where he was going or who he'd been talking to, and he'd made up some story to cover his meetings with David? How many conversations had we had about trust and honesty in our marriage while he was actively deceiving me? His face fell as he realized the full scope of what he'd done. He started to say he'd never thought of it as lying, that he was just keeping a surprise, but I could see in his eyes that he was beginning to understand the difference. A surprise was planning a party or buying a gift. This was systematic deception that had required him to lie to me repeatedly over an extended period of time. David tried to interject, saying that my husband had been conflicted about the plan, that he'd almost backed out several times because he was worried about how I'd react. But this information only made things worse. If my husband had had doubts, if he'd recognized that this might hurt me, why had he gone through with it anyway? Why had he prioritized his vision of a romantic gesture over my emotional well-being? I stood up and started collecting the abandoned plates and cups, needing something to do with my hands while I processed everything. The mundane task of cleaning up felt grounding after the emotional chaos of the last hour. Both men watched me work, clearly uncertain about whether they should help or give me space. As I stacked plates and emptied drinks into the grass, I found myself thinking about our marriage, about the trust we'd built over 3 years together. My husband had been the one who helped me heal from the damage David had done, who showed me what healthy communication looked like, who proved that relationships could be based on honesty and mutual respect rather than manipulation and control. But now I was discovering that he was capable of elaborate deception too. It was different from David's lies, motivated by love rather than selfishness, but the impact on me was startlingly similar. I felt destabilized, unsure of what was real, questioning what other secrets might be hiding beneath the surface of our apparently honest relationship. The irony wasn't lost on me that David, the master manipulator of my previous marriage, had somehow convinced my current husband to engage in the exact kind of behavior that had destroyed our relationship in the first place. He talked my husband into lying to me, deceiving me, prioritizing his own agenda over my feelings and well-being. Final update. I set down the stack of plates and turned to face both men. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across our ruined party, and I realized I needed to make some decisions about how to move forward. This couldn't just be something we laughed about later or swept under the rug. The trust in my marriage had been damaged, and it was going to take real work to repair it. I told David he needed to leave and that I didn't want him contacting either of us again. His role in this situation was unforgivable, and I wasn't interested in hearing about his sobriety or his personal growth or his desire to make amends. He'd proven that he was still the same selfish person who put his own needs above everyone else's, and I was done giving him opportunities to hurt me. He started to protest, saying he'd only been trying to help, but I cut him off. Help would have been staying out of my life like he had for the past 5 years. Help would have been respecting the boundaries that our divorce had established. Help would have been recognizing that his presence in my current marriage was inappropriate and unwelcome, regardless of the circumstances. David left without another word, and I felt a weight lift from my shoulders as the gate closed behind him. Whatever hold he'd had over my life, whatever power he'd maintained through his absence, was finally broken. I'd seen him for exactly what he was, and I was done being afraid of his ability to hurt me. But that still left me with the bigger problem of my marriage and what to do about my husband's betrayal. He was sitting quietly at the patio table, the ring box closed in his hands, clearly understanding that his romantic gesture had backfired spectacularly. The confidence and excitement he'd shown earlier had completely evaporated, replaced by something that looked like genuine remorse. I sat back down across from him and told him we needed to have a serious conversation about trust and communication in our marriage. I explained that the issue wasn't just the surprise gone wrong, but the months of deception that had preceded it. I needed to understand how he'd justified lying to me repeatedly, how he'd convinced himself that dishonesty was acceptable if the end goal was supposedly romantic. He was quiet for a long time before he started talking. He admitted that he'd gotten caught up in the idea of doing something grand and memorable, something that would prove how much our marriage meant to him. He'd been feeling insecure about our relationship lately, worried that the routine of daily life was making us take each other for granted, and he'd wanted to do something that would rekindle the excitement of our early days together. The insecurity surprised me. Our marriage had felt solid and stable to me, built on a foundation of friendship and mutual respect that was different from the passion and drama of my relationship with David. I'd seen that stability as a strength, but apparently my husband had interpreted it as complacency or boredom. He said that when David reached out, his first instinct had been to block him and never mention the contact. But David had been persistent, talking about how much he regretted the way things had ended between us, how he wanted to make things right. Eventually, curiosity had gotten the better of my husband, and he'd agreed to meet for coffee. That first meeting had been tense and awkward, with my husband making it clear that any attempt to interfere with our marriage would be met with swift consequences. But David had been charming and apologetic, sharing stories about his journey to sobriety and his recognition of the damage he'd caused. He convinced my husband that he genuinely wanted to make amends, not to interfere. The vow renewal idea had been David's suggestion, presented as a way for him to publicly acknowledge that he'd lost the best thing in his life and that my current husband deserved to be celebrated for treating me the way I should have been treated all along. It was supposed to be his gift to both of us, his way of officially blessing our marriage and stepping back from our lives forever. My husband admitted that he'd been flattered by David's apparent respect for our relationship and his recognition that my current husband was the better man. The competitive part of him had enjoyed the idea of David publicly acknowledging his defeat, of formally conceding that my heart belonged to someone else now. But as he talked, I could hear how David had manipulated the entire situation. He'd appealed to my husband's ego, his insecurities, his desire to be seen as the hero of our story. He presented himself as reformed and harmless while subtly encouraging behavior that he knew would damage our marriage. Even in defeat, he'd found a way to insert chaos into my life. I asked my husband if he'd ever considered how I might feel about having David involved in our marriage in any capacity. Had he thought about my history with manipulation and control, my need for transparency and honesty in relationships? Had he considered that his surprise might feel more like betrayal than romance? He was quiet again, and I could see him working through the implications of what he'd done. He'd been so focused on his own vision of the romantic gesture that he'd failed to consider my perspective entirely. He'd made assumptions about what I'd want based on what he thought would be impressive or memorable rather than what would actually make me happy. The conversation stretched on for hours as we worked through the layers of hurt and misunderstanding. My husband acknowledged that he'd prioritized his own desires over my emotional well-being, that he'd allowed David to manipulate him into behavior that went against everything we'd built our marriage on. He understood that the trust between us had been damaged and that it would take time and consistent action to repair it. I told him that I didn't want grand gestures or elaborate surprises. I wanted honesty and communication. I wanted a partner who considered my feelings before making decisions that affected both of us. I wanted to feel secure in our relationship, not constantly wondering what secrets might be hiding beneath the surface. He asked what he could do to start rebuilding the trust he'd broken, and I told him the truth. I didn't know yet. The hurt was too fresh, the betrayal too recent. I needed time to process what had happened and figure out how to move forward. I needed him to be patient while I worked through my feelings, and I needed him to understand that forgiveness wasn't something that could be rushed or earned through grand gestures. We spent the next several weeks in a kind of careful détente, both of us trying to figure out how to be married to each other again. My husband was patient and understanding, giving me space when I needed it and being available when I wanted to talk. He answered every question I had about his relationship with David, no matter how painful or uncomfortable the conversation became. Slowly, gradually, we began to rebuild what had been broken. The process was harder than I'd expected, requiring me to examine not just my husband's actions but my own responses and expectations. I had to learn to trust again, to believe that his remorse was genuine and his commitment to change was real. The vow renewal never happened, at least not in the way my husband had originally planned. Instead, we had a quiet ceremony in our backyard several months later, just the two of us, speaking words we'd written ourselves about the lessons we'd learned and the marriage we wanted to build going forward. It was simple and honest, and everything the original surprise had failed to be. David never contacted us again, and I was grateful for his absence. Whatever closure I'd needed from that relationship, I found it in seeing him clearly for who he really was and recognizing that his power over my life existed only as long as I allowed it. My husband had learned his own lessons about manipulation and trust, about the difference between love and control. Our marriage survived, but it was different afterward. More deliberate, more conscious, built on a deeper understanding of what we both needed to feel safe and valued. The trust we rebuilt was stronger than what we'd started with, tempered by the knowledge that relationships require constant attention and care, that love alone isn't enough without honesty and respect. Looking back, I can see that the disaster of that barbecue was actually a gift in disguise. It forced us to examine our marriage, to address issues we hadn't even realized existed, to build something more solid and authentic than what we'd had before. It taught us both that real love isn't about grand gestures or dramatic surprises, but about showing up honestly and consistently for each other day after day in all the small and ordinary moments that actually make up a life together.